morning, Michael.
Good morning, Dr. Chen.
It's so nice to see you again. Let's talk about today's topic is really, really important as we are heading into Thanksgiving, Christmas, can't believe that we're in November right now. It was like yesterday we were planning, like the resolution list and things gonna do this year. Now we're in November. And a lot of parents are start to think about getting some gift for their friends. And I'm sure a lot of parents who have children on spectrum getting text message from their family members like, hey, what should I buy for little Johnny? So this episode, we're going to talk about the sensory-friendly toys and why these toys are so helpful for young children on the spectrum, especially when it comes to sound and sight. And we know that kids on the spectrum process sound and sight very differently, and they have a very different sensory needs. I have one kiddo can jump on a swing like 3 hours in a row, and I was like there for 15 minutes. I felt so dizzy, right? Like all those differences among kids on the spectrum. Can you talk to us a bit more about like what are some common mistakes parents make when choosing toys for their children on the spectrum?
I love this conversation because we're talking a lot about the sensory system. And we can think about toys, especially for young kids. One of the biggest mistakes is what you said. What you think might be the best sensory for you might be terrible for your child, and vice versa. So I think it's realizing that all of us have different sensory needs and systems. And so even for me thinking out loud, I'm a big fan of visuals. I use my eyes a lot. So I think realizing that to observe your child and see what sensory systems that they're using more of, or in some cases that they're running away from or that are very aversive, I think we kind of forget about that a little bit. Of course, now they make toys that do a little bit of everything. So even though we're splitting it up in different categories, by all means, there's toys that both make sound and they have sight and you can touch them. In some cases, you can even smell them too. But I think that's one of the biggest mistakes is just looking at your child's sensory needs and making that the focus versus what your sensory system is telling you what's helpful.
And some of our parents are probably they just got a diagnosis of autism, or they're so new to this autism thing. And the terms like sensory stimulation, my child is overly stimulated, or my child need more sensory input, can be very new to them. Can you talk a little bit more about different sensory modality and what do we mean by sensory toys?
I love this question, especially for someone that is newer to the journey. So the analogy that I like to use is that we all, when we get any input, so think of the sensory system, the brain needs to know what's happening, and it uses the sensory system to understand temperature, understand, do I feel hot? Do I feel cold? The different sounds. So that's how the brain absorbs all this information and then makes decisions. What happens for all of us is we all have different sensory systems or sensory needs. So the example I like to use is, for me, I could sit in a space where there's music in the background and it only is filtered as a background. It's like a 2 on the scale because my brain knows to filter it out. It knows it's not a threat. It knows that it's not necessary. So it doesn't do anything. It just kind of observes it. So it's a 2 for me. But you can be someone that has a more sensitive sensory system. And instead of being a 2 for you, it feels like a 9. It feels like there's a rock music concert happening behind you. It makes you anxious. It makes you where you can't focus. And it's the exact same volume. So just think of it as some people are just more sensitive to sound or sight or taste, touch, smell. Even it's called, we'll talk about later, vestibular movement, meaning the back and forth. That's why kids like to swing. So I think it's just being aware that for some folks, what you go, oh, these lights above me, like I have lights above me, don't bother me at all. For another person, it's like staring at the sun. And I think that's where parents get confused when their children run from things that for them seem normal, but for that human and child, it feels sometimes unbearable.
As you're talking, one example came to my mind was yesterday we had a Halloween party with a bunch of kids. And there were two kids on the spectrum. One of them stepped on a balloon and she loves that sound. And then her friend right away put hands over his ears and start to scream. It's just too much. Like these two kids both have autism, but they process sound very differently.
And that's the big thing. Autism runs in all the directions like most humans. So just because one kid with autism is really sensitive to sound doesn't mean another one, because that's the other end of the spectrum. So there's hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. There's other kids, just like the kid you talked about with the trampoline, they can listen to sound all day long. They can listen to it cranked up to 10. They would love the rock concert. They enjoy the aspect for it. So I think that's what creates confusion. Some kids are running towards the loud noises. Some kids are running away from the loud noises. And so I think it's really making sure that you are observing your child and really kind of seeing kind of where they fit on the sensory side of the spectrum.
I think you talked about observing your child. And in one of our podcasts, we talk about our strategy, observing, waiting, and listening, right? I think for parents who are listening to our podcast, the takeaway here is when you think about buying toys, the first step is to observing your child and take a note of the data you recorded, the journal you've been writing, like what kind of toys your child likes based on your observation, and get some input from the teachers. And if you have a relative to call you, like what gift I should get for Johnny, and share those notes with them, and probably they will save a lot of money, buying a gift that's actually helpful for little Johnny. Well, Michael, let's move on to our second question, which is, how can a parent figure out if their child is more sensitive, to sound, or they need more sensory input, the sound, the visual, and then you mentioned earlier about that kind of movement of the body?
So using that observation strategy, I think once you observe, so this is where I would take, the couple different toys or just things I have, put them in an area and just watch what your child kind of gravitates toward. And then that can give you some input and say, okay, I see that they tend to like this one a little more. And then maybe that way you can introduce, some more, let's say they like audio. Well, maybe try to introduce some music and different styles of music and see if that helps. So you observe and then you try a very, very small experiment to see if that helps to have a better understanding. When it comes also to sensory and the sensory input, I think it's also realizing that our sensory inputs do change. So they're not completely static. So music's a great example. They may like music, but they might like this style of music versus another style. So really it's about observation. And then really the next part is making sure you're doing small experiments. Let me try this little activity and see if our child runs towards it, runs against it, or is indifferent. And then another thing to realize, there's some kids that just don't play with toys. So let's say you play all the toys out and all your kid wants to do is just clap their hands a lot, or play with their lips or put things in their mouth. That's still giving you a lot of data. So maybe for that kiddo, that might be a more tactile kiddo. It's that feeling. And one of the things that, from working with lots of kids, sometimes it's hard to know what is the primary driver of that sensory system. So if a kid is clapping their hands while vocalizing, is it the pressure of their hands that they're liking? Is it the vocalizations that they're hearing? Is it the movement? It could be a mixture. So I think you're trying to isolate the variables as much as possible. And by all means, there could be things that are together interlocked. But that observation allows you to say, if he's clapping his hands a lot and making sound, let me see if I focus on the sound piece and see if that's more advantageous or not. And let me focus on the tactile piece. I think helps you to kind of sort out what is primary and secondary sensory systems that a kid is running towards or running against.
I love the idea of experimenting things, right? Like, I remember there's a kid, it's the same trampoline. If you put it in a sensory room, he hates it. But if you put it in a classroom, he likes it. And you try to figure out, like, what's wrong with the sensory room? Well, the sensory room's too crowded. There's just so much stimuli around. The classroom is very, very structured. There's different centers, so neat, and it's easy for him to navigate. It's almost like a brain is more receptive to the different toy at that, across different locations. And I think for parents, experimenting things really gonna be a really good first step. You have worked with over 1,000 kids, Michael, and just really want to pick your brain on the scenario you mentioned. Kids doesn't really like any toys. I think for parents who have children who have very severe autism, it's almost like, well, we have all the toys there, and he doesn't play any of those. He just band them together, and he would rather, just twirl a string for an hour. Putting hands in his mouth for an hour, and we don't know what to do. And for parents who have children who have such a heavy sensory needs, what are some suggestions you have in terms of like toys or things that actually they can do in the environment?
I love this question because this is, could be very challenging if a child is not interacting with the environment readily, whether they're in their own space or engaged, with lack of focus to the toys, it can definitely be a challenge. So I think the first step, we talked about the observation and the experiment, but it tends to be trying to figure out, that dominant sense. So in the case of kids that's just wandering around, whether they're vocalizing or clapping or just pacing, I'm gonna start to really think about the tactile part of the system. What can I do that I can just see if I can engage this child? And I always tell parents and staff, the two reinforcers you always have are your hands. And so when I interact with a kid like that, let me see if I just kind of put some light pressure on their arm. Do they like that and ask for more? Or do they kind of pull their hand away? Let me try some tickles. Some kids love tickles. Some kids hate tickles. And it's your experiment to kind of find out where your kid is leaning at that point in time. So I think that's always my fundamental. If a kid is not interacting with toys, sight and sound may not be the dominant. I'm gonna at least experiment with tactile, which is touch. So it is soft touches. It is rough and tumble. A lot of these boys, they do like the big squeezes. And so giving them a big bear hug. And I'm always, as I do the experiment, I pause and I look at my child and I'm looking for what interaction am I getting. So I think, let's say I get the child, I give a big bear hug, and then do I get high engagement? Meaning the kid looks at me, open eyes, lots of excitement. Oh, okay, I'm gonna farm that away. I may be onto something. Or I may get just kind of, like they didn't hate it, they didn't like it, or they start crying. So it is observe, experiment, and it's really just after I do the little experiment, I'm looking for a reaction. Now, we'll talk, maybe a little later. Just because a kid has a bad reaction doesn't mean, this is the one thing. It's about trend line. If I do 5 bear hugs and the kid looks at me excited 5 times, it is more likely I have found a new potential reinforcer. And, part of this conversation is when you find things that a kid is willing to engage with, now you have learning opportunities. We keep talking about keeping those windows of opportunities open. I think this is a really good example of your experiments giving you more future opportunities to teach your child almost anything.
And that just really opened the door to more reinforcers. I think in the last episode, we talked about every interaction opens a window of opportunity. And once you discovered that, like, oh yeah, this sensory toy really works, and the bear squeeze really worked, and the kids are saying more please, and you are shaping the language, you are teaching imitation, and that's your window of opportunity, and that will lead to another window of opportunity. That's how we get better. Now the question is, okay, so say we have a child who is highly sensitive to touch, or a child has a very strong desire to be hugged, to be squeezed. What are those toys parents can think about in the environment or buy it and to help their kids?
So yes, I guess, should we go over each different sensory system? And maybe we can kind of talk about
Yep, let's do that.
Each one. So, because all your kids are different, and sometimes some things are in the middle. So let's start first with sight, because I think that's one of the easy ones. So these are the toys that they light up, and we've all been to a toy aisle, right? And I think it's not chicken or egg. There's reasons why all those kid toys make so much sound and noise. And also to keep in mind, if you are really sensitive to sound, you can also try to get things that are not super noisy. When you're getting toys, don't do that to other parents. Just give your kids or give your family members the noisiest toys around. But when it comes to sight, I think it's really trying to first do this experiment and don't spend a lot of money. I think sometimes people want to go buy $1,000 bubble tube because it looks nice. I think it's starting with the very inexpensive thing. Make sure your child can play with it, not break it. So I like things that just are different styles of lights. Something that could be very calming from a light standpoint or very active. So I think those type of things. So there's like little tubes, things that kids can turn over left and right. Can you really help that way? Things that change color, I think are very helpful. For some kiddos, I like and there's homemade, there's DIY, but you can make with solutions, you can make a tube. So you get like a water bottle, there's some different colorings in there, and you can kind of shake it, and you can slowly see the liquids going from one side to another. I think are just some examples. So it doesn't always have to be expensive. It could be a homemade craft, but kind of fits that sight friendly toy.
And then that's also opportunity for them to, if you're making that with your child, that's an opportunity. You can actually use that time to teach different skills and actually go through a routine to make things together. Yeah, that's a great example of different visuals. How about sounds? I think a lot of parents can be driven crazy, right? Like toys that make stop right now. I have done that. Take the batteries out. It's just too much.
There are some kids that I know. A kid, one of the first kids I ever worked with, he will play the song "Happy Birthday to You" 1,000 times a day if you let him. Just over and over and over. So on one hand, I can definitely hear, but auditory is just such a powerful tool. And it really goes back to the power of music, right? Music is just audio tones that are put towards a certain rhythm. And so for a lot of kids, good and sometimes inappropriate, but they'll fixate. And they'll fixate on a sound over and over and over again. This is why both typical and kids on the spectrum will sometimes play the same thing, like a same part of the movie over and over and over again. So there's probably a sound and a sight quality. So when you think of sound, I always think of just music. Kind of know, does my child like music that is calming and slower? That kind of helps them to regulate? Do they like the upbeat stuff that kind of pushes it? And so I think that's one of the simplest things to look at. And there's unlimited amounts of different styles of music out there. And there's a lot of things that are really the cause and effect toys, right? So I'm a big fan that they push a button on a book and then the book says moo because there's a cow there. And so you get a little mix. There's a little bit of touch, but really it's that sound interaction. And then it gives you an opportunity. So you get the book, they push the cow goes moo. You can now say moo. Oh, look, the cow goes moo. And then you can pause and see if they want to go moo, or they might just make any attempt. So I think that's a really good example of how the sensory system becomes the learning opportunity that you can then try. So that's another big one. And then, for some kids, it's just having the white noise. So for me personally, I'm a big fan of white noise when I sleep. When it's too quiet, my sensory system's a little too sensitive at night. And so maybe even thinking about white noises when a kid is learning or when a kid is sleeping might also help to drown out some of the sounds, are just some examples of sound toys.
And I definitely think kids would kind of specific, it's not that the whole video clip, just like specific part of at the 2 minutes, at the 3 minutes.
Yes, and they'll play that over and over and over. And on some aspects, yes, that could be quote unquote non-typical. But I know for me, there's movies I've watched probably a scene 100 times. So that's one thing to always think about is we have all these sensory related systems. It just happens that for some kids on the spectrum or other related ones, including ADD and ADHD, that is 1 degree and a bell curve more sensitive or less sensitive. And so I think that's the thing to keep in mind. We sometimes just go, oh, it's just kids who have sensory issues. There's lots of people walking around right now that have unregulated sensory issues that explains their frustration. So kind of while you're doing this, it might be a good idea to do your own sensory assessment. And maybe that can help you to reduce some triggers, in the process. So that's why I think I like this talk, is really just thinking about your systems and the systems of the people that you care about.
Same parents have who are on the different chapters of this journey, and I definitely see a difference. I think it seems that parents who are in the early chapter of a journey tend to think this is very problematic. My child, this is a problem. This is something I need to get rid of. I cannot have him play Happy Birthday song for 100 times. It's a behavior I want to get rid of. I think for parents who are more coming to a term of this is who my child, who he is. And like you said, Michael, that we have a music all of us want to play over and over again. Everyone have our own favorite. I think parents who are in the later part of the journey of that book, and they start to think about more being acceptive of what's going on. Their child is a different, right? Like you said, it's a spectrum. That's why we call it autism spectrum disorder. It's not something we need to, get rid of. And to some degree, I felt a lot of this is a child coping mechanism. When I'm tired, I like to put the music on. When I'm tired, I want to sit in front of the couch, have a bowl of popcorn, and start to watch some of my favorite show. I think for some of our kids, they're like happy mood, is when they play Happy Birthday song, when they read the same book 50 times, and then when they just see the SpongeBob, that specific clip of SpongeBob, when they read just that one page of that book and then look that little bunny at the corner of that book, and I think it's like how you mentioned, we all do that. It's just where you are on the spectrum. I think that's why researchers, some of them have been saying, actually, everyone have a little, element of autism inside of us. And we are just very different. And where we are on the spectrum is very different as well.
Yes. Every human has a different set of sensory, cognitive, spiritual systems. And it's for each person to understand their own, no matter where they are and how they work. But I think one of the things that you said, which is very important, is in the early part of the journey, you want to control the sensory system, but the truth is you're trying to understand the sensory system. And I think that's a big difference. It's not that I have to get my kid to stop clapping. It's trying to understand what can we do with that sensory system that can help them to learn, and they can still clap. And then maybe over time, clap could be turned into something else. It might be turned into drumming, or it might turn into something that helps with rhythm, or it might help them to remember things because they're using the tactile to jolt their learning. So I think that's where you want to ride the wave of the sensory system and understand it versus how do we cap it and restrict it, I think is that journey of process. What I wrote down is we have to remember an overstimulated brain is not a brain that's going to learn. And so even when you're thinking about these toys, it's saying what type of toys give me more learning opportunity. And maybe that might be a fundamental way to look at it. They all don't have to be educational toys. We'll talk a little later about apps and that type of thing. But I think that might be a good way to kind of kill two birds with one stone. What gives me an opportunity that I can interact also and maybe open up a window of learning while I am introducing some of these new sensory toys?
And for parents who are listening, I do want to highlight the take-home message here Michael talked about is the difference between control your kids and understanding your kids. And I think this represents very different two mindset. Control your kids is, it's got to be my way. I don't want you play happy birthday song. Just play once, that's enough. And you set the rule. What happened there, it's very coercive interaction between you and your child. It may not help with communication, may not help with building that routine. But at the same time, understanding is very different. It's where you are experimenting with a different situation. You're trying to understand, why is he playing happy birthday song? Why does he look at the fish tank for so long every day? What part of the fish tank that's interesting? And start to think about the different sensory modality, visual, auditorial, things like that. And then I think from what we've seen working with the parents is once you switch from this control to understanding mindset, yourself feel more relaxed, yourself enjoying this journey more, and you start to accept your child better and understanding like, okay, there are a lot of fun things actually I can read in this chapter about autism. And if you start to control less, and your child will start to open up more.
Yes. It's curiosity. I think it's getting people to the point of, instead of being anxious about an uncertain future, being curious about what's happening with my child in the present. And that's a shift, and rightfully so. There's so much uncertainty when you get a diagnosis. It's then turning that into the curiosity. Why does he do that? And not in a negative connotation, but what can that be a future opportunity? Is that kind of mind shift to keep reminding yourself throughout the journey.
Yeah, embracing autism and experimenting. That's great. I just really like how you put the words there, controlling versus understanding. Okay, so we talk about the visual, the hearing, and I think the smelling, right? The olfactory sensory stimulation is one of the area we don't talk a lot. And it's almost like we don't know what to do. What kind of toys there can take advantage of that sensory modality. So what are some smell-friendly toys that parents can take advantage of?
So this is one, both smell and taste are kind of hard for a toy for the holidays, but I think those are probably the two that probably some of the strongest tied to memory. And so we know through from research, smell is one of the easiest, not the right word. Smell is one of the strongest memory sensors. So all of a sudden you go by and you smell some vanilla, if you like vanilla, automatically dopamine hits your brain, you smile, your shoulders relax. So it's such a powerful sense. And the opposite, you smell something that is, you walk by a garbage can and smell something that doesn't work. Even me saying garbage can, you can start to feel a reaction that starts to even happen in your body. So I think there's not a lot of toys, but there's a lot of opportunities to maybe test the environment. And you want things that are safe, but there's lots of good smelling activities. So maybe one day it's saying vanilla, and maybe using vanilla, something that's subtle, nothing not too strong, and just see, does your child notice? So maybe it's like more of an assessment. How much does your child use their nose for the environment? Is it overstimulated or understimulated? I think it's one way to do it. There are some sensory toys or DIYs. So one of the things that we made, which is a little smell kit. So we took these little small containers, think about your little salt and pepper shakers, and then we took a cotton ball, and then we could put different smells. So we put one with vanilla, there's one with orange, and so you can get like little kits where you can even, just kind of make your own. And then we kind of would cover it. So then that way, it was almost like a surprise. We would take the ones, and the staff would open up the one like, this is vanilla, and just kind of see the reactions. And for some kids, they loved it because it's a very curiosity thing for them. Some kids didn't like it because it was a little bit too much. But I think that's where the creative ones of people listening to this can really find a way. And so it's kind of a toy, it's kind of a learning opportunity, but that was one that did very well. And then we also, although I am not the biggest fan of Play-Doh, to be honest, but there are some things that are scented Play-Doh wise. If your kid likes to eat Play-Doh, maybe you need to find something else that is useful. But in my opinion, we really neglect this sense out of all of them. It is a really powerful motivator. It might be helpful for the learning phase. So one thing I'm always curious about with a mixture of sound and smell, let's say I need my kid to calm down, I might be able to use those two sensory systems to really get a kid in a learning opportunity state. And so I think those are the experiments on the clinical side and on the home side that need to happen more often to get that kid to the point of excitement about what's happening in the environment.
And the cool thing about those, it's easy for parents to put together. Cotton ball, sounds like a little jar.
Yeah.
And some essential oil.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yes. I'm a big fan of sensory kits. I think every person, even for us, if you're going to have a rough meeting, it'd be nice so you could have a good smell, something that you like before you go into the meeting. Might be something. So who knows? We might have to make sensory kits for people who have too many meetings.
And a sensory pillow that filled with the lavender. Oh, that's good. And also, I think there are some markers, the coloring markers are scented too. You can color it and then just smell the paper, have different smell that come with it. You mentioned about taste often goes together with smell. That's tied to our memory. What are some taste-friendly toys?
So taste is it's challenging because it's so temporary, so fleeting. So I think it's really thinking about, and this is one of the things which is a whole nother conversation about kids being aversive to different taste and activities. So this is where the earlier you can get a young child to know there's different things that are edible and enjoyable, the better. It is challenges. And like I said, there's a whole other, aspect to it. There are some kids who have some sensory where they do a lot of chewing and mouthing already. So in that case, there might be some jewelry, sometimes a chewable activities. It depends on the kid. It depends on, what's happening. But I think for some that could be helpful. There are some kits that are kind of edible. So I always think of like the gingerbread house. So if your kid starts to eat part of the gingerbread house, it'll be okay. And this is where a lot of these kids do not drink enough fluids, particularly water. And so really trying to get your kids just the biological things, enough sunlight, enough water, enough protein. I think really starts to get into this area. How can I do some different flavored waters? How can I expose kids early? And this is one thing to think about. There are times you're going to first expose a kid to something and they are going to freak out and they are not going to like it. And it's going to be a challenging situation. Now, you don't want to put your kid in, and constantly just do it till they like it. I think you need to find that Goldilocks balance. We have to remember, if you have a sensitive system, you're going to tend to overreact to the environment. And then once you start to at least understand what it is, I think things that could be aversive a month ago might become tolerable or even enjoyable later. So the analogy I like to use is, we've all heard a song on the radio for the first time and hated it. The song is dumb. What is this lyric? Why is it making that sound? But what happens is it gets lots of airplay. And so all of a sudden it plays, 8 times a day. And you still don't like it, but that one little end is catchy. And then 2 days later, you're like, I kind of like this song. And then 3 days after that, it's your favorite song in the whole wide world. There is something to the process that the brain needs to recognize it is not a threat. That's kind of step one. And that's what happens to a lot of kids. It's a threat, I'm running from it. And really trying to get a kid not to run from stimulus when possible, when your kid's in the right mental space. But you'll start to see that, okay, this is not a threat. Oh, this is what I can do with it. So the parent, this is why I love parents eating with their kids. Seeing you eat the green bean too and not make a face, I think is very important. And then you allow the kid to experiment in a very calm setting, I think really helps. Because what happens is, kid freaks out once, and then the parent goes, I'm not doing no auditory. That's it. I'm never doing music again. And now we've actually not allowing the brain to get more inputs, to realize that this sound is not a threat. I think is an important aspect while we're doing this experimentation. You're gonna have some experiments that are just not gonna work. Some you probably shouldn't do again, but I think there's others, you might have something there, especially if the overreaction for something that was new, that was introduced.
I think it's such a common mistake for parents, all parents, right? Like your child freaked out, is like, oh, there's no way I'm doing it again. And we shut down that opportunity way too soon, trying to avoid at any cost. And I think I love the analogy you mentioned about the song played on radio. The first time we hate it, but it takes time. You never know. Just give several opportunities, not just one. And well, to wrap up this episode, I just really want to invite parents, if you have any thoughts on today's episode, or if you have discovered really a cool toy that's tied to a sensory needs of your child, you have seen how that worked, and you have tried something the first time and your child reaction is not good, but you kept trying several times, and how that turned into a reinforcer for you, please share with other parents. And we're here to help each other, and we're here as community. And thank you so much for joining today's episode. Please join our Facebook and check our website and subscribe to our video. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.